Hello, my name is Ellen Brown. I'm an attorney and an author. I've written 11 books. My latest book is this one, The Web of Debt, The Shocking Truth About Our Money System and How We Can Break Free. The shocking truth about our money system is that there is no real money in it. Except for coins, which compose only 1/10,000th of our money supply, all of our money is created privately by banks when they make loans. That includes Federal Reserve notes or dollar bills, which are issued by the Federal Reserve, a privately owned central bank, and then lent to the U.S. government and to other banks. So, excuse me, so those banks then are allowed to leverage that deposit base into many times that sum in loans, and that's where all of our money comes from. Because the bankers are in control of the money supply, when the banking system falters, or when we have a credit freeze like we have right now, our entire economy falters, because our entire economy is based on this money that is issued as credit by banks. So the result has been that business can't get the money that they used to be able to get, so they wind up laying people off, and you have unemployment. The housing market's collapsing because we don't have the credit that we used to have, and therefore states are going bankrupt because they don't have the tax base they used to have. Because of unemployment, they don't have as much income tax, and because of housing, they don't have those taxes. So the states, 48 of 50 states, are currently not able to meet their budgets either this year or next year. And so what they're doing instead is that they're having to slash services, and this is at a time when we particularly need social services because people are out of work. And they're raising taxes again at a time when people can't afford higher taxes because they're out of work or having trouble finding work. And we're selling off our state resources. These are things we've actually paid for, and now we're going to have to rent them back. The parks, roads, bridges, parking meters, anything they can, airports, ports, they're selling off to private investors, and then we'll wind up paying fees for our own assets. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the problem was there was not enough money in the system. The food was there, the food was laying on the ground, but there was no money to pay the workers to pick it, and there was no money to buy it in the grocery stores. So the food was there, and then the people were starving, and it was only what was missing was just the flow of money or the flow of credit to get them from one to the other. So we're being reduced to the status of a third world country. We're having to tighten our belts because of a failed Wall Street banking system. Meanwhile, the Wall Street bankers are getting trillions out of our government on the presumption that if we don't preserve this banking system, then we won't have a credit system. But that is not true. In fact, we can create our own credit exactly the way that banks create it. We can have set up an alternative credit system in which states would own their own banks. Any large public entity could own its own bank, a municipality or a state university system like the state of California, or the University of California could own its own banking system. One state in the Union does this. That's North Dakota. North Dakota is one of only 2 states that are currently able to meet their budgets. In fact, the state now has the largest surplus that it has ever had. It has plenty of money for everything it needs to do. It's got plenty of money for student loans. It makes low-interest loans to farmers. It funds municipal bonds. It acts as a sort of central bank in the state, so it partners with the other banks so they don't feel threatened. They're actually helped by this whole system. So they've managed to keep their money within the state. And the way they've done this, ever since 1919, they have put all their state's revenues in this one bank, the Bank of North Dakota. In 1919, the farmers were losing their farms to the Wall Street bankers in the same way, the same situation that we're in now. And so they got fed up with it and banded together and got some legislation passed. So now all the state's revenues go in this one bank, plus they have private customers, so they have a huge deposit base, and then they can use those deposits, as any bank can, to create many times that sum in loans for all their credit needs. So every state could and should do this. In California, we are now $26 billion in the red, and therefore we're having to take all these extraordinary measures to try to meet our budget. What we could do is take our state revenues, or just take what we have in deposit right now. The state has $17 billion on deposit in various banks, and these are the banks that have refused to fund our IOUs, so we don't owe them anything. We could pull that money out of those banks, put it into our own bank, and then use it for the deposit base to basically solve our credit crisis. We could fund infrastructure and all those things we think we don't have the money for. We could have the money for, because money is only credit. So we could create the credit for those things if we set up our own banking system. So that's my proposed solution to the banking crisis. And if you have any questions, you can go to my website, www.webofdebt.com. I have many articles there, and I have an active blog. Thank you. Talk about the recent financial meltdown, what just happened, and what we might be able to do to fix it. The bailouts that we've seen recently are out of control. They've already promised or spent or committed or lent $2.7 trillion for all these various things. That's on top of a federal debt that now is up to $10 trillion. You can see from this chart, this goes back to 1940, but actually the federal debt has never been paid off since the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson shut down the second U.S. bank and took the money out and paid off the debt. So you can see it's been growing ever since. So if you add 2.7 trillion up here, we just increased the debt by more than a quarter in a year, a debt that's been growing for at least 70 years here. This is an exponential curve. You can see that the debt is growing exponentially. That the last bit that we've added onto it is up here somewhere. This is a mathematical exponential curve. In math, it would go up to infinity here. But if you have some sort of finite food source or some limit on your ability to grow, this is what happens. You hit the wall and it just drops right back down. So in this case, the limit is the amount of, either the amount of interest that we can afford to pay on our debt, since we never pay it off. All we ever do is pay the interest, or the ability to find willing borrowers to keep rolling the debt over. Every time these bonds come due, somebody has to be found to buy a new bond, or to replace those bonds. Oops. So what we have here is a pyramid scheme. The reason it's this pyramid scheme is that our entire money supply comes from banks in the form of loans, except for coins, which compose only 1/1000th of the money supply. It's the nature of a pyramid scheme or Ponzi scheme that new investors, or in this case borrowers, have to be found continually, have to be sucked in at the bottom continually to support the lenders at the top, until finally the whole world becomes indebted, which has happened here. It's been 300 years that this Ponzi scheme's been going on, ever since the Bank of England, 1694. And we've managed to indebt, or I shouldn't say we, the private international banking cartel, if you will, has managed to indebt the third world, and now they're back to us. And so the latest debt bubble was the housing bubble, and then when they ran through all the people that could actually afford mortgages, they went into the subprime, the people that couldn't afford their mortgages, and now there's no one left. Okay, this is the money supply, M3 money supply. This down here is M1, M2, M3. M1 is what we normally think of as money. It's coins, dollars, and checkbook money. That's like Federal Reserve notes and checkbook money. So the actual physical money, coins and dollar bills, is only about 3% of the money supply. That comes to about there. And then, and dollar bills are actually issued by a private banking corporation, the Federal Reserve, and lent to the government. So they're not issued by the government either, and they are issued as loans from the private banking industry. And that only composes 3% of the money supply. So the question is, what is all this? 97% of the money supply consists of electronic money that is generated as loans by banks. That's so hard for us to get our minds around. It's so foreign to what we've been taught that it's hard to believe, but many authorities have attested to it. I have a couple of pages of them here, but I'll just read the first couple. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with a flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. That was said by Sir Josiah Stamp, who was president of the Bank of England in the 1920s, and he was speaking at the University of Texas. Then Graham Towers, governor of the Bank of Canada, said, banks create money. That is what they are for. The manufacturing process to make money consists of making an entry in a book. That is all. Each and every time a bank makes a loan, new bank credit is created, brand new money. Banks do not lend their depositors money, and they do not lend their own money. They create new money every time they make a loan. Okay, I'll skip down to the horse's mouth here, the Chicago Federal Reserve at the bottom. This is from a little booklet called Modern Money Mechanics. It was originally published in 1963, but it was republished all the way up till 1992. Of course, banks do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes in exchange for credits to the borrower's transaction accounts. Loans or assets and deposits or liabilities both rise by the same amount. The way it's done is through double entry bookkeeping. For example, if you go to a bank to take out a $500,000 loan, you will sign a document called a mortgage, and that is a negotiable instrument with a present value. And so the bank will put that on one side of its books as an asset of its own, because you've promised to pay that back over time. And then on the other side of their books, they'll write the same $500,000 as a credit into your account or a liability to themselves because they owe you that money. So at the end of the day, they'll say, well, we didn't create anything. It all comes out to zero. But in fact, this deposit that they just made on your behalf is what you spend into the economy, and that's what becomes our currency. This chart was actually also in the booklet Modern Money Mechanics. It makes it quite clear. This is what happens with a 10% reserve requirement. The Federal Reserve requires banks to maintain 10% of their deposits on reserve. Well, you would think that that would mean that here's your deposits, and that means you can lend out 90% of your reserves. You would think that that would mean that they would lend out all this here, like 90% of this 10% reserve. This is $10,000. But you can see that that's not what it means. That $10,000 stays in the bank. That's your money. If you're the depositor, you expect to be able to draw on that money at any time. You don't expect that somebody has just borrowed it for a 30-year loan. So what happens is the bank creates 90% of that. On top of this $10,000, the bank can lend out $9,000. That's created out of nothing, created on their books. And then that money is going to go into some other bank, probably, and then that becomes a deposit, which can be 90% of that can be lent out, or $8,100, and it just continues up and up and up. this is more pillars here, until that happens 20 times, and by the time it's all the way up to here, you've got $100,000. So your $10,000 has been fanned into $100,000 in loans. At the same time, this is a chart of inflation, or a decline in purchasing power of the dollar, as the amount of money out there increases, the purchasing value of the money decreases. So you can see it's the same sort of exponential curve as those others, except that this one's going the other way. And the problem is what we used to call the miracle of compound interest. You usually see these charts as something that's exciting and wonderful if you're an investor, because you can put your $10,000 in the bank when you're 25 here, and if you leave it in for 40 years, your $10,000 becomes $100,000. But that works the other way. Somebody has lost all that money. So that's the bankers or the lenders. If you're the lender, that's a good thing. But the banks are accumulating all this money off the top, and that's why you have to have a continually expanding money supply, or otherwise, say you started with $100 and you let banks lend 10% of that and roll it over with principal and interest continually. In a mere 40 years, they would have all the gold or all the money, unless you have an expanding money supply. This is a chart of the interest on the federal debt. You see that it too is an exponential curve going off into the stratosphere. That's only up till 1990, so you can imagine where it is now. And if you compare these two charts, this is the national debt and this is the money supply. You can see they're essentially the same thing. In fact, the federal debt basically is our money supply. The reason is, since all money comes from loans, and private loans eventually get paid back, but the federal debt never gets paid back. So any increase in the money supply comes from an increase in the federal debt. This is how it's done. The government prints pink pieces of paper called bonds, and it trades them with the Federal Reserve for green pieces of paper called Federal Reserve notes. Now we, the taxpayers, are on the hook for the face amount of the bonds, in this case $100, but the Federal Reserve gets their green pieces of paper for the cost of printing them, or I think it's up to about 6 cents a bill now. So they're getting what's called the seigniorage, or the benefit of creating this money, not the government. So that raises the natural question, why doesn't the government just print the green pieces of paper and skip the pink piece of paper? Either way, it's inflationary. Either way, you're adding to the money supply, and you're adding to the... Why not skip the debt and just put it out there into the money supply? The answer is that at one time we did. In fact, for the first 100 years of our existence before we were actually a nation, the American colonists came up with this brilliant idea where they didn't have money, they didn't have gold, and the governor of Massachusetts had to fight a war, and he didn't have any money to fight it with. So he decided to just issue these little paper receipts, and he paid the soldiers and all the people that he owed money to, and he said, you know, go, this is legal tender, go spend it in the community. And that became their money supply, and it worked really well. It worked better for some colonies than others because it was all experimental, and they didn't, you know, they just started out with this idea. So in the northern colonies, they tended to just issue money and issue money. They were supposed to tax the people to bring it back to avoid inflation, but they weren't very good about the taxes, and so mostly they were just issuing money, and they hyperinflated the money supply. But in Pennsylvania, they had the ideal system where instead of just printing and spending, they lent most of the money. They had a bank. The Pennsylvania provincial government owned its own bank, and it lent money to the farmers at 8% interest. I mean, sorry, at 5% interest. And the British bankers were lending at 8% interest, so this was a good deal for the farmers. And the money went back to the provincial government, so it was a completely closed system. And then to avoid this usury problem where you always are taking back more money than you put out, they put out some money. they printed some extra money for their expenses, roads, bridges, whatever it was they needed in the government. So, for example, if you started with $105, you could lend $100 at 5% interest, then spend an additional $5 into the community. Then you'd have $105 circulating in the community. That $105 would all come back to the government as principal and interest, and then you could lend the very same $100 again to someone else, spend the same $5 into the community, and $105 would come back. So you would never have to inflate your money supply, but you still could have an interest system. It works as long as the interest is going back to the government, and as long as the government also has the power to issue money, and it issues some extra on the side. Benjamin Franklin was called the father of paper money. He was really excited about this whole system. He said it was due to this paper money that the colonies were thriving when in England they were suffering the Industrial Revolution, the poverty conditions of the Industrial Revolution. He said, there are three great friends, an old wife, an old dog, and ready money. That was in Poor Richard's Almanac. Many that understand business very well but have not a stock sufficient of their own will be encouraged to borrow money to trade with when they have it at a moderate interest. That's the whole idea of credit. That is actually what has made our country great for 300 years. The ability to get credit. You hear about these microloans that are so exciting to people in third world countries. They're up to like 20% interest for if you get a microloan for a house, which is like really high. But it's so exciting to these little entrepreneurs to get a $50 loan, because without that they have nothing. They have no way, they have no collateral, nothing that they can put up to get started with. Well, in our country we've been blessed with this system, even though the banking system is ultimately flawed and has now reached the end of the line. It has worked up to this point to give us ready credit, and that's what's funded all the development that we've experienced. Franklin also said that because of their ready paper money, by 1750 there was abundance in the colonies and peace was reigning on every border. It was difficult and even impossible to find a happier and more prosperous nation on all the surface of the globe. Comfort was prevailing in every home. The people in general kept the highest moral standards, and education was widely spread. It worked until King George got wind of it in the 1750s. Actually, it was the British merchants who complained because they were getting paid in this paper money that from the New England colonies was devaluing, and so they complained to the king, and so the king said we couldn't issue our own money, and that caused a depression in the colonies, because then all they could do was use gold, and they had to pay taxes to England in gold, and they didn't have gold. So that meant they had to borrow from the British bankers, so that put us in debt to England, and we naturally rebelled against that. According to Benjamin Franklin, that was the real reason for the Revolutionary War, the fact that they took away our money. The colonies would gladly have borne the little tea tax and other matters had it not been the poverty caused by the bad influence of the English bankers on the Parliament, which has caused in the colonies hatred of England and the Revolutionary War. An English historian named John Twells reinforced that idea. He said, issuing their own scrip was the monetary system under which America's colonies flourished to such an extent that Edmund Burke was able to write about them. Nothing in the history of the world resembles their progress. It was a sound and beneficial system, and its effects led to the happiness of the people. In a bad hour, the British Parliament took away from America its representative money, forbade any further issue of bills of credit, these bills ceasing to be legal tender, and ordered that all taxes should be paid in coins. Consider now the consequences. The restriction of the medium of exchange paralyzed all the industrial energies of the people. Ruin took place in these once flourishing colonies. Most rigorous distress visited every family and every business. Discontent became desperation and reached a point, to use the words of Dr. Johnson, when human nature rises up and asserts its rights. So that meant war, but the problem was we didn't have any money to conduct a war. So the amazing thing was, it was a marvel around the world that we managed to win a war and we didn't have any money. What we funded it with was this paper scrip. The problem was, of course, as everyone knows, that the Continental devalued so much by the end of the war that it was virtually worthless, so everybody got disillusioned with it. And that everybody blamed the government for hyperinflating the money supply, but that is not actually what happened. The reason it devalued was that it was because it was paper, but paper at that time was easily counterfeited. So what happened was that the British, as a matter of war policy, counterfeited the Continentals, and they printed so many. They printed more than the Continental Congress printed. So that was one thing that happened to it. They had ships outside the harbor in New York that were madly printing money, and they advertised that anybody could have it for any amount of money. So they wanted to get it out in the circulation to devalue our money. Besides that, the Continental had to compete with the state's scrip, which had more credibility because they were backed by taxes and police and so forth. This was the scrip of an army that might not even win. So, given the choice, you would always take gold or you would take the state scrip. So that meant it's just like today with third world countries, how their currency gets devalued relative to the dollar. You'd rather take the stronger currency, so then the weaker one that trades for less and less. And then what finally killed it was the speculators. They went around and they said that money's not going to be worth anything after the war, and they bought it up for pennies on the dollar from the soldiers and the people who had earned it. This is Goldsmiths minting coins. They would keep people's gold for safekeeping, and people didn't really like carrying this heavy gold around. It was heavy and it was unsafe. And so the goldsmiths would issue these pieces of paper, these banknotes they were called, that were actually receipts for the gold. And then they discovered that that people would want to borrow these notes, and they discovered that they could actually issue 10 times as many notes as they had gold, because people only came for their gold about 10% of the time. And that's the basis of our 10% reserve requirement that we still use today, the fact that people only come for their money 10% of the time. So it's a fraud, actually. It's counterfeit money. The Bank of England was founded in 1694, again, to fund a war. It was a war of William and Mary. And they did the same thing. They paid with paper banknotes that were many times the amount of gold they actually had. And the Bank of England's paper notes eventually became the national currency. So we followed that plan. Jefferson was Hamilton's political rival, and he was always highly suspicious of this system. But at first, he like all the other founding fathers, thought that the fault was that it was paper money. He said, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution, taking from the federal government the power to borrow money. I now deny their power of making paper money or anything else a legal tender." That was in 1798. But later, he figured out that it wasn't what the money was made out of. It was who issued it that was the problem. He said in 1815 in a private letter, "The Treasury, lacking confidence in the country, delivered itself bound hand and foot to bold and bankrupt adventurers and bankers, pretending to have money, whom it could have crushed at any moment." He wrote in another letter, "Although we have so foolishly allowed the field of circulating medium to be filched from us by private individuals, I think we may recover it. The states should be asked to transfer the right of issuing paper money to Congress in perpetuity." Of course, that didn't happen, but Jefferson was instrumental in getting the charter for the first U.S. bank was not renewed, but then at that time Nathan Rothschild was the head of the banking business in England, and he said, or he is alleged to have said, that if we didn't renew the charter, that we'd find ourselves in another war with England. And sure enough, we had the War of 1812, which had no real political basis. And to fund that war, we did then charter the second U.S. bank. But Andrew Jackson was another great enemy of the banks, and he was highly suspicious of it. So he shut it down in the 1830s and took the money out. But after that, all we had was wildcat banks. We didn't have any national currency, or We just had banknotes from individual banks that might or might not really have the money. So Lincoln also found himself facing a war. As soon as he got into office, there he was involved in a war with no money to fund it. And so he went to the British bankers, or the Wall Street bankers, and they, who were backed by England, and they were offering loans at 24 to 36% interest, very high rates. And so he knew that would be that was usurious, and that would quickly bankrupt the North. And that was the whole idea. They wanted to bankrupt the North. So he said thanks but no thanks, and he issued his own money. The man that recommended that, he said, will they accept this paper money? And I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name. He said, well, they'll have to. It's legal tender. He said, if you market legal tender and you issue it, they'll just if you say it's honored everywhere in the country, then it will trade as money. And sure enough, it worked brilliantly well. Not only did the North win the war, but during the period of the Civil War, we had more expansion and productivity than we'd ever had before. They built railroads all the way across the country and did things for agriculture and education, and because they had the money to do it. So these were the greenbacks, the first government-issued money that was similar to what the colonists had done, and it hadn't been done up till then. But the British bankers were opposed to it, of course, and they said privately, the great debt that capitalists will see to it is made out of the war must be used as a means to control the volume of money. To accomplish this, the bonds must be used as a banking basis. It will not do to allow the greenback, as it is called, to circulate as money any length of time, as we cannot control that. They wanted the money to be backed by government bonds or debt to the banks. By then, the British banking industry was dominated by the Rothschilds, the Rothschild family. The patriarch of the Rothschild family was Amschel Rothschild, and he said in 1791, a famous statement, "Let me issue and control a nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws." That was their goal, to control nations by creating the currency. So they were instrumental in getting the National Bank Act passed in 1863. It was the forerunner of the Federal Reserve Act. It allowed private banknotes to become the national currency. In another private communication, they said, "The few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent upon its favors that there will be no opposition from that class, while on the other hand, a great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending, will bear its burdens without complaint." So that's what we still have. That system led to a series of bank runs because the banks didn't actually have enough gold to cover all their paper banknotes. And so every time the depositors would figure that out or get suspicious of a bank, they'd all pile in at the same time to try to get their money out, and the bank wouldn't have the money, and so it would have to close its doors. So that happened all through the 19th century. And then there was a particularly bad bank run in 1907. And so J.P. Morgan spearheaded the push to backstop these bank runs with a banker's bank. Actually, there's pretty good evidence that he caused that bank panic in 1907. So that worked. They got their Federal Reserve Act passed, and it authorized the Federal Reserve to print paper banknotes called Federal Reserve notes and to buy government bonds with them, and those banknotes are our national currency. That would have been all right if the Federal Reserve were actually federal, but of course it isn't. It's owned by all the banks. There are 12 different Federal Reserve banks, and they're all owned by the individual member banks in the community. For instance, the New York Federal Reserve is owned by about 500 member banks. Carroll Quigley, who was professor of history at Georgetown University and was Bill Clinton's mentor, he wrote in Tragedy and Hope in 1966, The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans. In 1924, the chairman of the board of the Midland Bank said, "Banks can and do create money, and they who control the credit of the nation direct the policy of government." So the Rothschild plan was working. The Federal Reserve Act was passed supposedly to backstop bank runs, but it obviously didn't work because we had the biggest bank run in history in 1933. So Franklin Roosevelt, knowing he had to do something, took the dollar off the gold standard. At that time, the dollar was 40% backed by gold, so that meant every time somebody came to the bank with $2 and got their gold out, $3 worth of loans had to be recalled. And because we were in a depression and everybody was worried about the banking system, they were all cashing in their dollars for gold. So it was collapsing the currency, and it would quickly have resulted in a serious lack of money if he hadn't taken the dollar off the gold standard. So he did. The other thing he did that we could do today, and I think we should do today, was Hoover had set up something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a a government-owned lending facility. The point of it was to try to bail out the banks, but it was making loans to the banks under Hoover, but that didn't work because they didn't really need more loans. They needed customers. They needed a thriving economy. So Roosevelt took that same engine and used it to fund projects that would put people back to work. So that was the basis. That's what funded the New Deal, including Fannie Mae and the Homeowners Loan Corporation and all the dams and all the projects we've heard about that put people back to work during the New Deal. And then the engine really got put to work with World War II, where they funded all this development of tools and machinery in order to make airplanes to fight World War II. And those tools set us up to be an industrial power for the second half of the century. The only problem with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was that it was funded with government debt originally. I mean, they issued bonds, and then they sold the bonds, and then the money was lent out. So the way you could fix that started off our federal debt that's been growing ever since. But the way you could avoid that, and what I think they should do today, is to lend in the same way that banks do. Just create the money. You can just create credit and lend it to yourself as a government. You could even lend it to yourself interest-free. That's what Australia did. Their bank, the Commonwealth Bank, was owned by the government, their central bank, during the Depression, when everyone else was experiencing a depression. And they made loans to themselves at 0.5% interest and funded development, and in that way avoided the depression. And so did New Zealand. After the Depression, the Federal Reserve took upon itself to avoid any further depressions, and the way they did it was to continually expand the money supply. Every time there was a threat of a recession, they would just pour money into the system. And so of course they expanded it by increasing the debt. So here you have, for instance, the savings and loan collapse in the 80s was overcome with the stock market boom of the 90s, and that was done by lowering interest rates. And then in 2000, you had the collapse of the dot-com collapse. And to overcome that, they created the housing bubble, which was done by lowering interest rates to very low levels and by relaxing lending standards, which basically meant eliminating lending standards so that anybody that walked in the door could get a mortgage whether they qualified or not. And you can see from this alarming curve here that it's another exponential curve that's out of control, or it was until it hit the wall. Because they were lending to everybody in sight, that meant that the banks would be assuming a great deal of risk. And so to avoid that risk, they moved the loans off their books by selling them to investors. They'd package them up into mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, chop them up into pieces, and sell them. So where it used to be just a deal between the borrower and the lender, now you have all these other parties involved. So you're getting farther and farther away from the borrowers. The lender is getting farther and farther away from the borrower. So the bank goes to a third-party intermediary, and then they arrange this mortgage-backed security, and then it's sold off to investors, and then it's protected with derivatives, and that's called the collateralized debt obligation, and they're buried in these SIVs, special investment vehicles. So this remoteness, that's one thing we can do. There's a lot of potential for lawsuits in here, but I don't have time to go into that. But that is one thing we can do to get back our money system. For instance, the homeowners, actually, most homeowners have a good defense to foreclosure, and that is that these securities holders, the trustees for the securities holders, don't actually have the paperwork that they need to foreclose, because these things have been sold and resold so many times, and they don't. The mortgage didn't follow them. So to induce the investors to buy these dodgy mortgages, they were protected with something called derivatives, which are basically just bets, but they were sold as a form of insurance. So the big one for default is collateralized debt obligations, which are up to $62 trillion on the banks on the books of U.S. banks. According to the Bank for International Settlement, as of last December, these bets became so popular that they were actually up to, this is not 500 billion, this is $500 trillion last December. And now, according to the Bank for International Settlements, they're over a quadrillion. That's 1,000 trillion. The gross domestic product of all the countries in the world is only 60 trillion. So this is obviously an out of control, impossible number. That's actually just the derivatives trades. There are different ways of counting the derivatives, but no matter how you count it, even if you only look at 62 trillion, that's still more than the gross domestic product of all the countries in the world. So how are those numbers even possible? It's because derivatives are just bets, and you can bet any sum that you want. So, for instance, on General Motors, I think there's something like 10 times the amount of bets on General Motors defaulting as General Motors is worth. So they just hyperinflate the value of things. So obviously this is another exponential curve that's about to hit the wall. You can't keep that up forever. One commentator used the example of a parasite in a jar. If you had parasites in a jar that doubled every minute, and you started at 11 p.m., and they filled the jar completely at midnight, at what point would the parasites feel like they had plenty of room left to grow where the jar was only half full? The answer is 1 minute to midnight. So when you're at this part of the curve, at first you go along and everything seems fine. Like this would be the first, if you counted this as 1940, the World War II, it looks fine for a while, and then it shoots up like this, and this is where it hits the wall. You just can't go any higher, and that's where we are, 1 minute to midnight. So the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, their approach to all this is to clean up the bank's books that are holding all these dodgy securities by trading them for our good U.S. debt. In other words, we're going heavily into debt in order to clean up their books. But that means we, the taxpayers, are paying interest on these bonds to the banks, which are trading them for their toxic collateral. We get the toxic collateral, and we're paying interest for the privilege of getting it. The bankers are obviously doing what the Federal Reserve was set up to do, which is to save the banks, but they're not saving us. We, the borrowers, we the taxpayers and the investors are going down with the ship while the bankers are getting out. So what should we do about it? Jefferson said, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation. The banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. We should create the money, not the banks, and that would fix the whole system. We could clean up the books. But everybody says, well, if the government could create the money, wouldn't that be highly inflationary? Here's a chart from an excellent website called shadowstats.com, where he tracks the real statistics, not the ones that the government has manipulated. And you can see here, this goes back to 1665. You can see that we didn't really have inflation during all that time when they were issuing the Continental. They were issuing their paper script. And during the 19th century, when the reason they didn't have inflation, of course, was that they would periodically have these depressions because they were, it was linked to gold, and gold was a tether that kept the money supply from expanding too much. We only really had this serious inflation since we've had the Federal Reserve printing money and printing money. So it's our borrowed money that has put us into hyperinflation, not the government printing money. Another way to avoid hyperinflating the money supply is if you use the money to create goods and services, you won't create inflation. Inflation is the result of demand exceeding supply, or the amount of money competing for goods and services going up faster than the goods and services. But if you have, let's say you have 100 widgets and you have $100 competing for 100 widgets, the price according to supply and demand will be $1 per widget. Now, if you add $1,000 to the money supply, or add $900, you have $1,000 competing for 100 widgets. That'll drive your price up to $10. But if you use that $1,000 to make 1,000 widgets, your price will still be $1. So what you can do is you issue yourself credit and use it to make things. And then so that will increase your supply. That's one way to prevent inflation. Another thing you can do is use it for things that actually pay money, such as low-cost housing. The rents would come back to the government, or developing alternative energy, and the fees that you generate from selling this energy go back to the government. So how much money could the government actually print without hyperinflating the money supply? Right now, these figures come from Richard Cook, although I did the chart. This was in 2006. The gross domestic product came to $13 trillion, and the wages and income of people only came to $10 trillion. So we only had $10 trillion available to buy a $13 trillion gross domestic product. We can't afford our own products that we create. So this money here is created as loans. This is all debt to banks. We've borrowed this money in order to afford our own products. And some of this income is actually invested. So there's really only $9 trillion available to buy $13 trillion in goods. And that's at less than full employment. If you were at full employment, it would be close to $15 trillion. So you would have $9 trillion available to buy $15 trillion. That leaves nearly $6 trillion that you could put into the system without driving up prices if you didn't allow banks to create this money. You could substitute government-issued money for bank-issued money. And if we can't get Congress to do it, the other alternative, which I think is actually better or more likely, or something that you could do in Michigan, would be for the states to do it. States, there are two banking systems. There's the state banking system and the federal banking system. So a state could buy up a bank and charter it. The only state that actually owns a bank is North Dakota, owns the Bank of North Dakota. And there, all the government's money goes into the bank. And North Dakota is fiscally sound. They're doing well when other states are going bankrupt. And they have, for instance, a very good student loan program when other states are scrambling to find the money and the interest is going up on their student loans. The reason is they have this huge deposit base that comes from the government, and they're just issuing money from that. Now, I tried to look into how they work it, and I couldn't find the details. But you could use this model and take all the government's money, put it into a state bank, and then on the fractional reserve system, you could magnify that money by a factor of 10. So you would have credit available to the state or to state and local governments of 10 times your deposit base. And because the state can charter the bank any way it wants, the state could set it up so that these loans could be made to state and local governments for like 1% interest or 0.5% interest or even 0% interest. And then they'd get paid back from the proceeds of the project. Or they could, if the proceeds were insufficient, they could get paid back by the taxpayers. But the cost of most projects is 50% interest, and that was what it used to be. And now it's getting worse because state and local governments can't find anybody to roll over their short-term loans. What they do, these auctions are popular where they roll over like 6-week loans to fund their 5-year projects, their long-term projects. But now there's nobody available to buy these short-term loans. And so, for instance, I read that the New York Port Authority had a 5-year project at 4% that it suddenly wound up paying 20% interest. Well, if you're paying 20% interest over 5 years, you've already tripled the cost of your project. So just think what you could do if you could take interest out of the equation. All these things that seem like they're not feasible, various alternative energy projects, would suddenly be quite not only affordable, but actually could generate a profit. So that was my quick run, but it's all explained in more detail in my book, Web of Debt. That's all.